Elira Vance had been alone for a long time. Not truly alone. There were others on the station. But she was the only human, and that made all the difference. Outpost Kefali 7 floated in the empty space between two spiral arms of the galaxy. It was a refueling station, a place where ships stopped to fill their tanks before continuing to somewhere more important. Nobody came here to stay. Nobody except the crew who had no choice. Elira had been here for 11 months. She worked as the station systems coordinator, which meant she fixed things when they broke and watched screens when they did not. It was quiet work, lonely work. But she had chosen it because she needed time away from crowded worlds and busy ports. She needed silence. The station was old. Its corridors stretched in long curves, and some sections had been closed for years. The lights in those places flickered or did not work at all. Strange sounds echoed through the metal walls, the groaning of old pipes, the hiss of recycled air, the distant hum of machines that nobody remembered how to turn off. Elira shared this place with 3 other species. The Chirik were insect-like beings with hard shells and many legs. They worked as engineers and kept to themselves, communicating in clicks and whistles that Elira could not understand. The Valori were tall and thin, with pale skin and eyes that seemed to look through everything. They managed the trading operations and spoke in careful, measured words. And then there were the Rethkai. The Rethkai looked like wolves that had learned to walk upright. They had silver fur that caught the light, amber eyes that glowed in the dark, and voices that could shift from gentle whispers to deep growls in a heartbeat. A family of 6 lived on the station, 2 parents and 4 cubs. The cubs were young. The oldest, a male named Tarek, had seen perhaps 5 standard years. His sisters, Mira and Kessa, were a year younger. The smallest, little Ven, still stumbled when he walked and spoke in broken sentences that made his siblings laugh. Elira noticed the cubs on her first day. They noticed her too. They watched her from corners and doorways, their amber eyes wide and curious. When she walked past, they would freeze like small statues, then whisper to each other after she had gone. She heard fragments of their conversations sometimes, words like strange and soft, and why does she show her teeth like that? She learned later that smiling was not common among predator species. Most beings with sharp teeth only showed them as a threat. But humans smiled when they were happy, when they were sad, when they were nervous, when they met someone new. To the cubs, it must have seemed very confusing. Elira tried to keep her distance. She had learned, in her years among the stars, that not every species wanted human friendship. Many saw humans as too intense, too emotional, too unpredictable. They laughed too loud. They cried too easily. They touched too much and stood too close and asked too many questions. The Rethkai parents made it clear, without saying a word, that they did not want their cubs near her. When Elira entered the mess hall, the mother would gather her children closer. When Elira walked through the hydroponics bay where the family worked, the father would step between her and the cubs like a shield. She understood. She did not take it personally. Humans were still new to galactic society, and trust took time. But the cubs did not seem to agree with their parents. Tarek was the bravest. He would follow Elira at a distance, ducking behind storage containers when she turned around. She pretended not to see him. It seemed kinder that way. Sometimes she would hum while she worked, old songs from Earth. Lullabies her mother had sung to her when she was small, and she would catch him tilting his head, ears perked forward, listening. One day, she left a small wrapped candy on a crate where she knew he was hiding. She walked away without looking back. The next morning, she found a smooth pebble on her workstation, the kind the Rethkai cubs collected from the hydroponics filters. She kept it in her pocket. Myra and Kessa were more careful. They watched from farther away, whispering behind their hands, giggling in the high-pitched way that Rethkai Young did. When Alira waved at them once, they ran away so fast they tripped over each other. But they came back the next day to watch again. Little Ven was too young to be afraid. Sometimes he would wander away from his family and end up in strange parts of the station. Twice, Alira found him sitting in a corridor, crying because he was lost. She would kneel down, speak softly, and wait until one of his parents came running to collect him. They never thanked her, but they never growled at her either, and she supposed that was something. The months passed slowly on Kethely 7. Ships came and went. Supplies arrived and were stored. The Chirrut clicked and worked. The Valori counted and recorded. The Rethkai tended their plants and raised their young. And Alira fixed things and watched screens and hummed her songs, and tried not to feel too lonely. She did not know, in those quiet months, that something else lived on the station. Something old, something hungry, something that had been sleeping in the dark places, in the abandoned corridors, in the spaces between the walls. It had been there for a very long time, waiting for the right kind of food. The cubs were growing. Their emotions were getting stronger. Their dreams were getting deeper. And in those dreams, there was so much beautiful, delicious fear. The shadows began to wake. At first, it was small things. Lights that flickered when no one was near the switches. Doors that opened to empty hallways. Cold spots in warm rooms. The cubs complained of nightmares, and their parents told them to be strong. But the nightmares grew worse, and the shadows grew darker. And somewhere in the oldest part of the station, something that had not moved in 100 years began to stir. Alira felt it too sometimes. A prickling on the back of her neck. A sense of being watched. She told herself it was nothing. Old stations made strange noises. Empty corridors played tricks on the mind. She was wrong. The shadows were waking. And they were very, very hungry. But they would learn in time that they had made a terrible mistake. Because among all the beings on Kethely 7, there was one creature they did not understand. One species that did not fit their ancient patterns. There was a human on this station. And humans did not leave children alone in the dark. Not ever. The first scream came on a quiet evening. Alira was in her quarters, reading an old book on her datapad, when she heard it. A high, keening wail that cut through the metal walls like a knife. She was on her feet before she knew she was moving, running toward the sound. She found Tarek in the mess hall, surrounded by worried adults. The young Rethkai was shaking so hard, his fur stood on end. His eyes were wild, darting to every shadow in the room. His mother held him tight, but he would not stop trembling. "Shadow walkers," he kept saying. "In the vents. They whisper. They have too many legs. They want to eat me. They want to eat me." His father knelt beside him, voice firm and calm. "There is nothing in the vents, my son. You had a bad dream. You must be brave. It was not a dream." Tarek pulled away from his mother, pointing toward the dark corridor that led to the eastern wing. "They are there. I saw them. They moved like smoke, but they had eyes. So many eyes." The Valori station commander, Sethric, folded his long arms and sighed. "The eastern wing has been closed for maintenance. The power systems there are old and unstable." The boy saw flickering lights, nothing more. "I know what I saw." Tarek's voice cracked with fear and frustration. "Why will no one believe me?" Alira watched from the doorway, saying nothing. She saw the terror in the cub's eyes, real terror, not the kind that came from bad dreams. She had worked with children before, on other stations, in other lives. She knew the difference between imagination and genuine fear, but she was an outsider here. The Rethkai would not welcome her involvement. So she stayed quiet and returned to her quarters. Though sleep did not come easily that night. The next morning, Mira refused to eat breakfast. She sat at the table with her food untouched, staring at the wall. "What is wrong?" her mother asked. "They come when we sleep," Mira whispered. "They stand at the edge of the bed. They breathe on our faces. They smell like cold metal." Her mother exchanged a look with her father. Both of them seemed troubled, but neither wanted to show it. Among the Rethkai, fear was a weakness. To admit fear was to bring shame upon the clan. "You will eat," her father said firmly, "and you will not speak of this again. Bad dreams pass. You must be strong." Myra ate her food with tears running down her silver fur. She did not speak again that day. Alira found herself thinking about the cubs more and more. She started paying attention to the station systems, looking for anything unusual. The power log showed strange fluctuations in the eastern wing, brief drops that lasted only seconds, never long enough to trigger alarms. The environmental sensors recorded small temperature changes in random locations, cold spots that appeared and vanished without explanation. She mentioned it to the Chirrut engineers. They clicked and whistled and told her the systems were old. Old systems did strange things. There was nothing to worry about, but the cubs grew worse. Little Ven stopped sleeping entirely. He would sit in his mother's arms all night, eyes open, watching the shadows. When anyone asked what was wrong, he would only shake his head and press his face against his mother's fur. Kessa started walking in her sleep. Twice she was found wandering the corridors in the middle of the night, moving toward the sealed doors of the eastern wing. She never remembered doing it. She would wake confused and frightened, with no memory of leaving her bed. Tarek stopped talking about what he had seen. But Alira noticed that he never turned his back to a doorway. He never walked alone. He flinched at every flicker of light, every unexpected sound. The adults continued to dismiss their fears. Bad dreams, overactive imagination, the natural fears of young minds on a dark, quiet station. But Alira was not so sure. One night she could not sleep. Her mind kept returning to the cubs, to their frightened eyes, to the way they looked at shadows, like the shadows might look back. She decided to walk. The station was quiet at this hour. Most of the crew was asleep. Alira moved through the empty corridors, her footsteps echoing on the metal floor. She passed the mess hall, the storage bays, the humming machinery rooms. Without quite meaning to, she found herself standing before the sealed doors of the eastern wing. The doors were old and heavy, marked with warning signs in 3 languages. This section had been closed for years, ever since a power failure had made it unsafe. No one came here anymore. Alira stood in the dim red light of the emergency signs, listening. At first, there was nothing. Just the usual sounds of an old station, the creak of metal, the hiss of air through vents, the distant hum of engines. Then she heard it, a whisper, not words, exactly. More like the memory of words, the shape of speech without sound. It came from beyond the sealed doors, from somewhere deep in the darkness of the abandoned wing. And then she saw them. Through the small window in the door, in the pitch blackness beyond, something moved. Not like a person or a machine. It moved like smoke, like shadow, like darkness, even form. And in that darkness she saw eyes, not 2, but many, scattered across the shape like stars in an empty sky. They looked at her. For one terrible moment, Alira could not move, could not breathe, could not think. The eyes held her, and she felt something brush against her mind, something cold and hungry and very, very old. Then the emergency lights flickered, and the shape was gone. Alira ran. She did not stop until she reached her quarters. She locked the door, pressed her back against the wall, and tried to slow her racing heart. The cubs had not been dreaming. The shadows were real. She spent the rest of the night searching the station's archives, looking for any record of what might be hiding in the eastern wing. Most of the files were corrupted or missing, but she found fragments, old reports from crews that had worked the station. Decades ago, they spoke of entities that fed on fear, parasites that existed in the spaces between dimensions, drawn to places where emotions ran strong. They were not truly physical. They could not be touched or harmed by normal means. They fed by manifesting fear, by making their prey see terrors, by drinking the chemicals that frightened minds produced. The reports called them shadow weavers, or fear eaters, or simply the dark things. And they were especially drawn to the young. Young minds dreamed more vividly. Young hearts felt more deeply. Young fear was stronger, sweeter, more nourishing. The cubs were not having nightmares. They were being hunted. Lyra sat in the glow of her datapad. The old reports spread before her, and felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. She had to do something. She did not know what, but she could not leave those children to be food for shadows. The question was, how do you fight something that is not really there? And how do you protect children whose own parents will not believe them? She did not have the answers. Not yet, but she would find them. Because somewhere in this station, 4 small cubs were afraid to close their eyes. And Lyra Vance had never been able to walk away from a frightened child. Not ever. Not once. Not as long as she lived. Lyra went to the station commander the next morning. She showed him the reports, the power logs, the environmental readings. She told him what she had seen through the window of the sealed eastern wing. Sethric listened with the patience of someone who had heard many foolish things in his long life. "You saw a shadow," he said when she finished. "You read old stories written by frightened crew members who were alone in space too long. These things happen. The mind plays tricks. The cubs are being affected," Lyra pressed. "They cannot sleep. They cannot eat. Something is feeding on their fear. The cubs are young and imaginative." Sethric rose from his chair, signaling that the meeting was over. "Their parents will handle them. This is not your concern, human. But the reports are decades old and unverified." His voice was final. "I will not create panic on my station because of old ghost stories. You may go." Lyra left his office with her hands clenched at her sides. She had expected this reaction, but it still made her angry. The Valori were logical beings. They did not believe in things they could not measure. And the creatures in the eastern wing were very careful not to be measured. She tried the Chiric engineers next. They clicked and consulted and ran their instruments over the sealed doors. They found nothing unusual. The power systems were old but functional. The temperature readings were within normal range. There was no evidence of any living thing in the abandoned section. "You are tired," their leader told her in broken common speech. "Rest. Eat. The shadows are not real." Lyra was running out of options. That night, she walked past the Reithkai quarters on her way to the observation deck. Through the door, she could hear the cubs crying. All 4 of them, their voices rising and falling in waves of distress. She heard the parents trying to calm them, their voices firm and steady. But the crying did not stop. She stood outside that door for a long time, listening. She thought about what she knew of Reithkai culture. They were pack animals, fiercely protective of their young. But they were also proud. To show fear was shameful. To ask for help was weakness. The parents would comfort their children as best they could, but they would not coddle them. They would expect bravery, strength, control. It was not working. Lyra made a decision. The next evening, she prepared a tray of warm drinks, sweet tea made from earth herbs she had brought with her from home. She walked to the Reithkai quarters and knocked on the door. the father answered. His amber eyes narrowed when he saw her. Human, he said flatly. What do you want? I brought something for the children. She held up the tray. It helps with sleep. It is harmless, I promise. We do not need your help. I know. Alira kept her voice soft. But your cubs are frightened. And I have something that might ease their minds, even a little. Please, just this once. He stared at her for a long moment. Behind him, she could hear the cubs whimpering, small and scared. Something in the father's face shifted, just a little, just for a second. He stepped aside. The quarters were small but comfortable. The mother sat on a low couch, all 4 cubs pressed against her. Their eyes were red from crying. Little Ven had his face buried in her fur. Tarek sat apart from the others, trying to look brave, but his hands were shaking. Alira knelt on the floor, keeping her distance. She poured the tea into small cups and set them in the center of the room. This is sweet, she said. My mother used to make it for me when I was young and could not sleep. It helped me feel safe. No one moved at first. Then Myra crept forward, sniffed the cup, and took a small sip. Her eyes widened. It is good, she whispered to her siblings. One by one, the cubs came to drink. Even little Ven uncurled from his mother's arms and tottered over to taste the strange human beverage. The parents watched in silence, unsure whether to stop this or allow it. When the cups were empty, Alira did something she had not planned out. She started to tell a story. It was an old tale from Earth, about a rabbit who outsmarted a fox. She spoke in a soft voice, painting pictures with her words. The green forest, the clever rabbit, the silly fox who kept falling for tricks. The cubs listened with wide eyes. Even the parents seemed drawn in, though they tried to hide it. By the time the story ended, little Ven was asleep in his sister's lap. The other cubs looked calmer than they had in weeks. Thank you, the mother said quietly. It was the first time she had ever spoken directly to Alira. Alira nodded and gathered her tray. I will come again tomorrow, if you allow it. The parents exchanged a look. The father's jaw was tight, but the mother gave a small nod. You may come, she said, and so it began. Every evening Alira brought tea and stories. She told the cubs about the little train that never gave up, about the lost elephant who found his way home, about the girl who was not afraid of the dark, because she knew the dark was afraid of her. The cubs began to wait for her. She would see their small faces pressed against the door grate before she even knocked. Tarek would save her a spot on the floor. Mira would ask questions about the characters. Kessa would demand stories about brave wolves. Little Ven would crawl into her lap and fall, asleep before the tale was done. But the parents watched all of this with complicated expressions. They did not like it, Alira could tell. In their culture, only Pack was allowed such closeness with the young. To let an outsider touch their children, hold their children, tell their children stories, it went against everything they believed. But the cubs were sleeping again. The nightmares did not stop entirely. The shadows still lurked in the dark corners of the station. But somehow, the fear was less. The parasites could not feed as easily when the cubs were wrapped in warmth and stories and the smell of sweet tea. You are making them weak, the father said one night. After the cubs had gone to bed, Alira looked at him steadily. They are children. They are supposed to feel safe. Safe makes soft. Soft makes prey. I respectfully disagree. Alira stood her ground. Children who know they are loved grow stronger, not weaker. Fear does not build strength. It only builds more fear. The father growled low in his throat, but he did not argue further. The evidence was before his eyes. His children were eating again, sleeping again, laughing again. Whatever the human was doing, it was working. But Alira knew it was only a temporary solution. The creatures in the eastern wing were still there, still hungry, still waiting. Every night she could feel them pressing against the edges of the station, testing the boundaries, looking for cracks. They were patient. They had been waiting for a very long time, and sooner or later they would find a way through. She did not know how she would stop them when that moment came. She did not even know if they could be stopped. But she had made a silent promise to those 4 small cubs, who looked at her like she was the safest thing in the universe. She would protect them. Somehow, no matter what it cost, because that was what humans did. They protected children. All children. Even the ones who are not their own. It was, perhaps, the most human thing about them. The 43rd night began like any other. Elira made her rounds through the station, checking systems, noting any problems. The eastern wing was quiet. The power readings were stable. For the first time in weeks, everything seemed almost normal. She was in the maintenance corridor when the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a brief interruption. Every light on the station died at once, plunging everything into complete darkness. Then the emergency power kicked in, and the corridors filled with dim red light. That was when the screaming started. It came from everywhere. From the engineering section, from the mess hall, from the crew quarters. Not just one voice, but many, all crying out in terror. The station shook as people ran through the corridors, trying to escape something that was suddenly, terribly real. Elira ran. She passed a Chiric engineer curled against the wall, his many limbs wrapped around himself, his body shaking. His eyes were open, but seeing nothing. Something dark clung to him like a blanket of shadow, pulsing with a life of its own. She passed Sethric, the station commander, frozen in the middle of the corridor, with his mouth open in a silent scream. A shape moved around him, darker than the darkness, and she could see its many eyes turning to look at her. The parasites had stopped hiding. They had stopped being careful. They were feeding openly now, manifesting fully, no longer shadows, but writhing masses of darkness and hunger. Elira did not stop. She could not help the others. She could not fight these things. But she knew exactly where she needed to be. The Rethkai quarters, the cubs. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life. Her lungs burned. Her heart pounded. The red emergency lights made the corridors look like the inside of something alive. She could feel the creatures reaching for her as she passed. Cold tendrils brushed against her mind, trying to find her fears, trying to grab hold. But human minds were strange things, too chaotic, too loud, too full of contradictions. The parasites could not get a grip. They slid off her thoughts like water off stone. She reached the Rethkai quarters and slammed her hand against the door panel. It was locked. She pounded on the metal. Open up. It is Elira. Please, let me in. The door slid open, and she stumbled inside. The scene before her froze her blood. The parents were standing in the center of the room, completely still. Not frozen by choice, frozen by force. The same paralytic field that had caught Sethric now held them in place. Their eyes moved, wild with fear, but their bodies could not. They could only watch and in the corner, surrounded by shadows, were the cubs. The creatures had come for their prize. They circled the 4 small bodies, their forms shifting and changing, their many eyes gleaming with hunger. Tarek stood in front of his siblings, his small body trembling, his teeth bared in a growl that was more fear than threat. Mira and Kessa huddled behind him, crying. Little Ven had his eyes squeezed shut, his hands over his ears. The shadows were whispering. Not words that could be understood, but sounds that slipped directly into the mind. Promises of endless darkness. Visions of being alone forever. The certainty that no one would ever come. That no one would ever care. The cubs were being consumed by their own fear. Elira moved. She pushed forward. toward the paralytic field that surrounded the children. She could feel it trying to grab her, trying to lock her muscles, trying to freeze her in place. It was like walking through water made of ice, but she did not stop. Human minds were too chaotic, too noisy, too stubborn. The field could not get a proper hold. It slowed her, but it could not stop her. Step by step, inch by inch, she forced her way through. The shadows turned toward her. Their eyes focused on this strange creature that would not freeze, would not fear, would not obey. They reached for her with tendrils of pure darkness, and she felt their touch, cold, so cold, but she kept moving. She was not thinking about herself. She was not thinking about the danger. She was only thinking about 4 small cubs who were about to be devoured by their own terror. She broke through. The paralytic field shattered around her like glass. She stumbled and fell to her knees, right in front of the children. The shadows screamed, a sound that was not sound, a frequency of rage and confusion, and pulled back for just a moment. In that moment, Alira did the only thing she could think to do. She opened her arms. Tarek looked at her. His amber eyes were huge with fear, tears streaming down his silver fur. He hesitated. "Come here," Alira said. Her voice was calm, steady, warm. All the things she did not feel inside. "Come here. I have you. You are safe." The cub broke. He launched himself into her arms, his small body hitting her hard enough to knock her backward. She caught him, pulled him close, and then the others came too. Myra and Kessa and Little Ven. All of them pressing against her, grabbing her clothes, burying their faces against her neck and chest. She wrapped her arms around all 4 of them. They fit. Somehow they fit. The shadows screamed again, louder this time. They pressed closer, their darkness filling the room, their eyes burning with hunger. They could feel the fear, so much delicious fear, but they could not reach it. Something was blocking them. Alira held the cubs tighter. She could feel their terror, their shaking bodies, their racing hearts. But she could also feel something else, the way they clung to her, the way they trusted her, the way they let her warmth wrap around them like a shield. She started to hum. It was the same tuneless melody she always hummed while working. A simple sound, not really a song, just a habit from her childhood. But the cubs knew it. They had heard it 100 times. In the corridors, in the hydroponics bay, in their quarters when she came to bring tea and stories. The sound cut through their fear like light through darkness. "You are safe," she whispered between the notes. "You are brave. You are not alone. I have you. I have you. I have you." The shadows could not feed. The fear was still there. Alira was terrified. The cubs were terrified, but it was wrapped in something else now. Something the parasites had never tasted before. Something they could not understand. Trust, love, the absolute certainty of being held. The creatures tried to force their way through this barrier. They threw themselves against it, again and again, their hunger driving them mad. But they could not break it. They could not digest it. They could not consume fear that was bound up in connection. They were starving. With a final shriek that made the station walls vibrate, the shadows fled. They poured out of the room like smoke, streaming through the walls and floors, racing toward the old sections where they could hide. But the station had nothing left for them. Every mind on Catholi 7 had felt what the human had done. Every being had seen the impossible. A creature of chaos had stood against the darkness and won, not with weapons, not with technology, not with logic or science or strength. With an embrace. The emergency lights flickered, and then the main power returned. The corridors filled with normal light. The paralytic fields vanished. All around the station, people began to move again, shaking off the terror like a bad dream. In the Rethkai quarters, The parents collapsed to the floor, freed from their frozen prison. They stared at the scene before them, their 4 children still wrapped in the human's arms, still pressed against her chest. The cubs were asleep, after weeks of nightmares. After nights without rest, they had fallen asleep in the space of a heartbeat. They clung to Alira, even in their slumber, their small claws tangled in her clothes, their faces peaceful for the first time in so long. Alira looked up at the parents. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking. She had never been more afraid in her life, but she did not let go. She would not let go until the children were ready, however long that took. The silence after the screaming was the loudest thing Alira had ever heard. She sat on the floor of the HFY quarters, 4 small bodies pressed against her, and listened to the station come back to life. Footsteps in the corridors, voices calling out to each other, the hum of systems resetting. The cubs did not wake. They slept with the deep peace of those who had been exhausted beyond measure and had finally found rest. Their breathing was slow and even. Their small hands stayed tangled in her clothes, holding tight even in sleep. The mother approached first. She moved slowly, carefully, as if afraid that any sudden motion might break the spell. She knelt beside Alira, so close that their shoulders almost touched. How? Her voice was barely a whisper. How did you do this? Alira shook her head. I did not do anything. I just held them. The shadow walkers have been feeding on stations like this for centuries. The mother's amber eyes were bright with unshed tears. They have killed hundreds, thousands. No one has ever stopped them. No weapon can touch them. No shield can block them. They feed on fear. Alira looked down at the sleeping cubs. Fear that is alone. Fear that has no anchor. When someone holds you, when you know you are not alone, the fear does not go away. But it changes. It becomes something else. Something they could not eat. The mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that made Alira's breath catch. She pressed her forehead to Alira's shoulder dot in HFY culture. This was the gesture of deepest respect. It was how pack members greeted each other after long absences. It was how children honored their parents. It was how clans welcomed new members into their family. You are pack now, the mother said. This debt we do not have words for. Our children live because of you. The father had moved closer too. His face was still and serious, but something in his eyes had changed. The suspicion was gone. The doubt was gone. He looked at the human woman holding his children and saw something he had never expected to see. He saw family. I spoke harshly to you, he said. I said you would make our cubs weak. I was wrong. Alira met his gaze. You were trying to protect them. I understand? No. He shook his head. I was trying to protect them the way I knew. The way my parents taught me. Be strong, show no fear. Face the darkness alone. He looked at his sleeping children. But they did not need to be alone. That was the weakness. My way was the weakness. He knelt on her other side and pressed his forehead to her opposite shoulder. You are pack, he repeated. Now and always. The cubs slept on Dot in the days that followed. The station slowly returned to normal. The Chirrut engineers examined every system, looking for traces of the parasites. They found nothing. The creatures had fled into the cold space between stars, seeking easier prey. There was nothing left for them here. Seth Rik, the station commander, called a formal meeting to discuss what had happened. He was still shaken. Alira had seen the look in his eyes when the paralysis broke, the memory of helpless terror. He was not the same being he had been before. I owe you an apology, he said to Alira in front of the entire crew. You tried to warn me. I did not listen. That was a failure of leadership. The important thing is that everyone survived, Alira replied. because of you." Sethric inclined his long head in a gesture of respect. "I will be recommending you for a consortium commendation. What you did was beyond extraordinary." Elira felt uncomfortable with the attention. She had not done what she did for recognition. She had done it because 4 small cubs were afraid, and she could not walk away. But she accepted the commendation when it came. A formal document with many important signatures. A note in her permanent record. A message from the Consortium Council, thanking her for her service. It meant nothing to her. What meant something was the way Tarek waved to her every morning. The way Myra shared her breakfast treats. The way Kessa demanded new stories every evening. The way little Ven reached for her hand whenever she was near. The cubs had stopped fearing the dark. Not because the darkness was gone. The universe was still full of shadows, full of things that hungered and hunted. But the cubs had learned something that no amount of training could teach. They had learned that fear could be shared, that terror could be survived, that even the darkest night could be endured if someone was holding you through it. Weeks later, a message arrived for Elira from the Rethkai homeworld. She opened it with curiosity. Inside was a formal notice. Written in the ancient script of the clans. It announced that one Elira Vance, human of Earth, had been added to the oral histories of the Kereth clan. Her name would be taught to cubs for generations. Her story would be told at clan gatherings and remembered in song. They had given her a title. The human who held the dark at bay. Lira read the message 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it with her most treasured belongings. The Rethkai family left Kefali 7 a month later. Their contract had ended, and they were returning home. The parting was harder than Elira had expected. She had grown used to small voices calling her name, small bodies crowding around her, small hands reaching for hers. On their last day, the entire family came to her quarters. "We will not forget you," the mother said. "Our children will grow and have children of their own, and they will tell this story, the story of the human who is not afraid to hold them." "I was afraid," Elira admitted. "I was terrified." The mother smiled, a Rethkai smile, with teeth that gleamed. "Yes, but you held them anyway. That is what made it brave." The cubs said their goodbyes one by one. Mira and Kessa hugged her so tight she could barely breathe. Tarek stood straight and tall, trying to be mature, before breaking down and hugging her too. Little Ven went last. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a smooth pebble, the same kind the cubs collected from the hydroponics filters, the same kind Tarek had left for her all those months ago. "For you," Ven said. "So you remember." Elira took the pebble and held it in her palm. It was warm from the cub's pocket, smooth from years of tumbling through water filters. "I will keep it forever," she promised. Ven nodded seriously, satisfied with this answer. Then he wrapped his small arms around her neck and pressed his forehead to hers. "You are Pack," he said, with all the gravity his young voice could hold. "Now and always." The family boarded their transport and flew away into the stars. Elira stood at the observation window for a long time, watching their ship grow smaller and smaller until it vanished into the endless dark. The station was quieter after that. The corridors felt emptier. Elira went back to her routine, fixing things, watching screens, humming her tuneless songs. But something had changed. She kept the pebble in her pocket. She kept the message in her quarters. She kept the memories in her heart. And sometimes, late at night, when the station was silent and the stars were cold and distant, she would stand at the observation window and think about 4 small cubs somewhere, out among those stars. They were growing now, getting bigger, getting stronger, learning about the universe and their place in it, and they would tell their own children, someday, about the human who had taught them the most important lesson of all. You did not have to. Face the darkness alone. You did not have to be brave by yourself. Just had to find someone willing to hold you. Until the shadows went away. That was the human way. The strange, soft, impossible human way. And maybe the Refkai were learning. It was not weakness at all. Maybe it was the strongest thing in the universe.